I heard my son whisper, "She won't last the week. We should be ready." And in that moment, something inside me went completely still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there in that hospital bed, eyes closed, listening to the quiet hum of machines and the low murmur of voices just outside the door. They thought I was asleep. They thought I couldn't hear them planning a future that didn't include me. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something colder, something emptier, like a place meant for endings. Just 2 days earlier, I had been rushed in after collapsing in my kitchen, my heart racing in a way that made the walls spin. At 68, I knew my body wasn't what it used to be, but I had never imagined becoming a conversation spoken in past tense while I was still alive. I had spent my life taking care of that boy, Daniel Collins, working double shifts when his father passed, stretching every dollar so he could go to college, building a home that always had a warm meal waiting. And now, here he was, standing just feet away, speaking about me like I was already gone. I heard Sophia's voice next, smooth and controlled, the way it always was when she thought she was being practical. "We need to start organizing things," she said quietly. "The house, the accounts, it'll be easier if we don't wait." There was no sadness in her tone, no hesitation, just efficiency. I felt my fingers twitch against the thin hospital blanket, but I forced myself to stay still. If they believed I was weak, if they believed I was slipping away, then I needed them to keep believing it. Because something about this didn't feel right. Not just their words, but the certainty behind them. As if my fate had already been decided somewhere I hadn't been invited. The door creaked softly, and their voices faded as they stepped into the hallway, leaving me alone with the steady beep of the monitor beside me. I opened my eyes slowly, staring up at the ceiling tiles, each one identical, each one blank. My chest rose and fell, steady, controlled. I wasn't dying. I could feel that much. Weak, yes. Tired, certainly. But not at the edge they seemed so sure of. A cold realization settled over me, heavier than any diagnosis. This wasn't just fear talking. This was expectation. They were waiting for the moment I would no longer be in their way. I turned my head slightly, looking toward the door they had just walked through, and for the first time in my life, I saw my family not as the people I loved, but as strangers standing on the other side of something I didn't yet understand. And deep down, beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, something sharper began to form. If they thought I was already gone, then maybe it was time I found out why. I did not sleep that night, not really. Even though the nurses came in twice to check my vitals and once to adjust the thin blanket that kept slipping off my shoulders. My eyes stayed closed, my breathing slow and even, but my mind would not quiet down. It kept going back to Daniel's voice, to the certainty in it, like he was not hoping I would recover, but preparing for the moment I would not. That was not how a son spoke about his mother. At least, that was not how I raised mine. I had always told myself that Daniel was just busy, that success had a way of pulling people in different directions, that Sophia had her own way of doing things, and I simply needed to respect that. It was easier to believe that than to admit something colder had taken root in my own family. I stared at the dim glow of the monitor beside me, the soft green line rising and falling in a rhythm that felt stubbornly alive, and I began to think back, not to the distant past, but to the past 2 years, to the small moments I had brushed aside. The way Daniel had insisted on handling my bills after I mentioned struggling to keep track of everything. The way Sophia had offered to organize my paperwork, taking folders home with her and returning them neatly labeled, but somehow thinner than before. I remembered laughing it off at the time, grateful for the help, telling my friends how lucky I was to have a son who cared enough to step in. Now, lying in that narrow hospital bed, those memories did not feel generous anymore. They felt deliberate. I thought about the house, the one on Maple Street that I had lived in for over 30 years, the same house where Daniel learned to walk, where every corner held a memory I had never been ready to let go of. A few months ago, Sophia had mentioned how much work it must be for someone my age, how maybe it would be easier if I simplified things. At the time, I had smiled and changed the subject. I did not want to imagine leaving the only place that still felt like home. But now, her words echoed differently, like they had never been about my comfort at all. A soft knock came at the door, and I quickly closed my eyes again, settling back into stillness. I heard footsteps, measured and calm, not the hurried pace of a nurse. Then a voice, low and careful. "Margaret." It was Dr. Harris. I recognized the tone immediately. He stepped closer, and I could feel his presence beside the bed, the faint rustle of his coat as he checked something on the chart. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he let out a quiet breath. "I know you are awake," he said gently. My eyes opened slowly, meeting his. There was something different in his expression, something more serious than before, like he had already decided something and was choosing his words with care. I did not say anything. I just watched him. He pulled the chair closer and sat down, lowering his voice even more. "Your condition is stable," he said. "You are not in immediate danger." The words settled over me, steady and clear, and for a brief second, relief flickered through my chest. But it was quickly replaced by something else. Confusion, because that was not what my son believed. Dr. Harris hesitated, then glanced toward the door before looking back at me. "There is something I think you should be aware of," he continued. His voice did not rise, but the weight behind it did. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against the blanket. "Over the past few days, there have been discussions," he said carefully, "about your care, about what should happen next." I held his gaze, waiting. He studied me for a moment, as if deciding how much to say, then leaned in just enough that no one outside the room could hear. "Not all of those discussions have been based on accurate information," he said. My heart did not race. It did something quieter than that. It sank, because in that moment, everything I had been trying not to believe began to take shape in front of me, piece by piece, forming a picture I could no longer ignore. And for the first time since I had been admitted, I realized that whatever was happening here did not start with my illness. It started long before that, and I had been the only one who did not see it. Dr. Harris did not rush his words, and that was what made them heavier, as if each one had been considered long before he stepped into my room, and I could feel the space between us tighten with something unspoken that neither of us could ignore any longer. I kept my eyes on him, steady, waiting, because I had already learned that silence revealed more than questions ever could. He folded his hands loosely and leaned back just slightly. "Still careful, still measured. There have been requests," he said, "regarding changes to your treatment plan." I did not react. Not outwardly, but inside something shifted, something cold and precise, because I knew immediately who those requests had come from. He continued, "Your son has been asking about long-term care options, hospice transitions, and timing." The last word lingered in the air longer than the others, like it did not quite belong but had been placed there anyway. I let out a slow breath through my nose, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to stay anchored. "Timing," I repeated quietly, and he nodded once, his expression tightening just enough to confirm what he was not saying directly. "They have been operating under the assumption that your condition is far more critical than it actually is," he added. And this time I felt it clearly, not shock, not even anger, but clarity, sharp and unmistakable, like a window finally wiped clean after years of fog. I turned my head slightly toward the window, the pale afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, thin lines, and for a moment I said nothing, because there was nothing left to deny. I thought about Daniel standing in that hallway, speaking in hushed tones as if respect could be measured by volume instead of intent. I thought about Sophia's careful words, always polished, always reasonable, always just enough to sound concerned without ever truly being it. And now I could see it all laid out in front of me, not as isolated moments, but as a pattern, a quiet progression that had been building long before I ever stepped into this hospital. "They think I am dying," I said finally, not as a question, but as a statement. Dr. Harris hesitated for half a second before answering, "Yes," and that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have said. I nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, not because I believed it, but because I understood what it meant, because belief was not the issue anymore. Perception was. And perception could be shaped, controlled, used. I looked back at him, my gaze steady. "And you have not corrected them," I said. And this time he did not answer right away, his silence confirming more than any explanation could. "I needed to be certain of what I was seeing first," he replied carefully, before I said anything that could not be taken back. I studied him for a moment, weighing his words, not with suspicion, but with something closer to recognition, because he had seen it too. The subtle shift, the quiet urgency that did not come from concern but from expectation. and for the first time since this began, I realized I was not the only one paying attention. I adjusted my hand slightly on the blanket. The movement small but deliberate, grounding myself in the present. Then do not correct them, I said calmly, and I saw the flicker of surprise cross his face before he masked it. Not yet, I added, and now there was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty left to soften the edges of what I was beginning to understand, because if they believed I was already slipping away, if they were already preparing for a life without me, then they would not be careful, they would not be guarded, they would reveal everything I had been too trusting to see before. Dr. Harris watched me closely, as if reassessing who I was in that moment, not as a patient, but as something else entirely, and after a second, he gave a slight nod, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. Very well, he said quietly, standing and smoothing the front of his coat. But you need to be prepared for what you might learn. I met his gaze without flinching, because the truth was, I already was. I had spent a lifetime giving people the benefit of the doubt, filling in the gaps with kindness, explaining away what did not feel right. But that version of me had been left somewhere behind the moment I heard my son measure my life in days. Now, I only needed to see how far they were willing to go. The door opened softly as he stepped out, and I was alone again. But it felt different this time, quieter in a way that was no longer empty, but focused. I turned my head back toward the ceiling, watching the steady rhythm of the monitor, listening to the calm, unwavering sound that proved I was still here, still present, still very much aware. And as I lay there, I made a decision without needing to say it out loud. I would not confront them. I would not question them. I would let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe, because the truth was no longer something I needed to find. It was something I was about to watch unfold, and this time, I would not look away. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a gradual shift in the light that crept through the narrow hospital window and settled across the floor like nothing had changed, but everything had. I kept my eyes half closed as footsteps approached the room. 2 sets this time, one heavier, one lighter, familiar in a way that no longer brought comfort. The door opened softly, and I heard Sophia's voice first, low and carefully arranged. She is still resting, she said, as if speaking about me instead of to me. Daniel followed, his tone quieter than I remembered from when he was a boy, but not softer, not anymore. The doctor said we should be realistic, he replied, and there it was again, that word, realistic, as if reality had become something they could shape to fit their plans. I remained still, my breathing slow and even, feeling the weight of their presence fill the room, not with warmth, but with something more clinical, more distant, like visitors waiting for a process to finish rather than a person to recover. Sophia moved closer. I could hear the faint rustle of her coat, the subtle click of her heels against the floor. We should start making decisions before it gets complicated, she said, and I pictured her standing there, composed, efficient, already organizing a future that did not include me. Daniel hesitated for a moment, just long enough to reveal that somewhere beneath all of this, there might still be something human left in him. But it passed quickly, replaced by something firmer. I know, he said. I just do not want to wait until the last minute. I felt a small, almost imperceptible tightening in my chest, not from illness, but from recognition, because I had heard that tone before, not here, not now, but years ago, when he first started making decisions without asking me, when he began to believe that knowing better meant knowing alone. Sophia lowered her voice further, but not enough to escape me. The house will be easier to handle if we move quickly, she said. In the accounts, we should make sure everything is accessible. Accessible. The word echoed in my mind, stripped of its politeness, revealing what it really meant. Control. They wanted control, not responsibility, not care. I shifted my fingers slightly beneath the blanket, the movement small enough to go unnoticed, grounding myself in the moment, because now it was clear this was not about uncertainty. This was about preparation, calculated and deliberate. Daniel let out a quiet breath. I will call the attorney this afternoon, he said, and for the first time, something inside me responded, not emotionally, but strategically, because that single sentence told me more than anything else they had said. They were not waiting for confirmation. They were moving forward regardless of it. Sophia stepped closer to the bed, and I felt the faintest brush of air as she leaned in, her voice soft, almost tender, but empty in a way that made it feel rehearsed. "We just want what is best for you," she said. And if I had not heard everything else, if I had not seen the pattern forming piece by piece, I might have believed her. I might have nodded, smiled, accepted the illusion they were offering. But now, those words did not land the same way. They floated, detached from meaning, revealing the gap between what was said and what was true. I opened my eyes slowly, just enough to let them see movement, just enough to remind them that I was still here. Sophia straightened immediately, her posture shifting, her voice changing, warmer now, brighter. "Margaret, you are awake," she said as if the last few minutes had never happened. Daniel stepped closer, his face coming into view, familiar, but distant in a way I could not ignore anymore. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and I looked at him for a long moment before answering, not searching for honesty in his expression, but measuring it, understanding it. "Tired," I said simply, because that was the truth, just not the one they thought. He nodded quickly, relieved, perhaps, that I had not asked questions, that I had not challenged anything. "You should rest," he said, and I almost smiled, not because of comfort, but because of how predictable it all had become. Rest, wait, fade. That was the version of me they were expecting, the one they had already accepted. Sophia adjusted the blanket slightly, her movements precise, controlled. "We are taking care of everything," she added, and this time, I met her eyes directly, holding her gaze just long enough to let her feel it. Not confrontation, not accusation, just presence. Awareness, something she had not accounted for, something she could not organize or manage. And for a brief second, something flickered across her face, uncertainty, maybe even discomfort, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by the same composed expression she always wore. They stayed only a few more minutes, speaking in soft, careful tones, saying the right things, doing what was expected, and then they left, the door closing behind them with a quiet finality that felt louder than any sound in the room. I lay there, staring at the ceiling again, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor, and this time, there was no confusion left, no lingering doubt, only clarity, cold and precise. They were already moving pieces into place, already shaping a future they believed was inevitable. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think not about what they were planning, but about what I would do next, because if they believed I was no longer part of the equation, then they would never see me coming. And that was the one advantage I intended to use. By the afternoon, the rhythm of the hospital had settled into something predictable, nurses moving in quiet patterns, machines humming with steady indifference. And yet beneath that calm surface, I could feel everything shifting, not around me, but because of me, or more precisely, because of what they believed about me. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, letting my shoulders sink deeper into the mattress whenever someone entered, letting my voice come out softer than it needed to be, not as an act of weakness, but as a choice, because every assumption they made was another piece of truth they would reveal without realizing it. When Dr. Harris returned later that day, he did not speak immediately. He closed the door behind him with quiet care and stood there for a moment, watching me in a way that felt less clinical and more observant, like he was measuring not my condition, but my awareness. I met his gaze without hesitation this time, no longer pretending to be unaware, no longer needing to hide that part of myself from him. "They have started making arrangements," I said calmly, and he nodded once, confirming what I already knew. "Your son requested copies of your medical records this morning," he replied, his tone even, but there was a weight beneath it, and he asked about expected timelines again. I let out a slow breath, not out of surprise, but out of recognition, because each step they took followed a pattern now, one that no longer felt random or reactive, but intentional. "I will need your help," I said, and that was the first time I had asked anyone for anything since this began. He did not respond immediately, but I saw the slight shift in his posture, the way his attention sharpened. "What kind of help?" he asked carefully. I adjusted my hand on the blanket, grounding myself again. "I want you to tell them what they expect to hear," I said, and there was no hesitation in my voice now, no uncertainty left to soften it. He studied me for a moment, longer than before, as if weighing not just the request, but the reason behind it. You are asking me to confirm a condition that is not accurate, he said, not as a refusal, but as a clarification. I held his gaze steady. I am asking you not to correct a misunderstanding that they are already acting on, I replied. And for a brief second, the room felt completely still, like even the machines had paused to listen. He exhaled slowly, considering it, then glanced toward the door before looking back at me. And what do you intend to do with that? He asked, and this time, I allowed the smallest hint of truth to surface. Not everything, but enough. I intend to see how far they are willing to go, I said, and the words settled between us with quiet certainty, because this was no longer about guessing or doubting. It was about witnessing, about allowing the truth to reveal itself fully, without interference. Dr. Harris straightened slightly, his expression more serious now, more aligned with what this had become. You understand that once this continues, it may not be easy to reverse what they put into motion, he said, and I nodded once, because that was exactly the point. I am not looking to reverse it, I replied. I am looking to understand it. And there was a difference, one that changed everything. He held my gaze for another moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not approval, but acceptance. Very well, he said quietly. I will proceed carefully. And with that, something shifted again, not in the room, but within me, because now this was no longer passive, no longer something happening to me. It was something I was choosing to let unfold, something I was actively observing, shaping, allowing. After he left, I turned my head slightly toward the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch longer across the floor, fading inch by inch, and I thought about the house on Maple Street again, about the kitchen table where Daniel used to sit doing his homework, about the way he used to look at me when he needed reassurance, when he believed I would always be there to provide it. And I wondered when that changed, not in a sentimental way, not with regret, but with curiosity, because somewhere along the way, something had shifted in him, in them, something that had turned care into calculation. And now, as I lay there, listening to the steady, unwavering sound of my own heartbeat, I realized that I was no longer trying to hold on to what we used to be. I was preparing to face what we had become, and for the first time since this began, I felt something that was not fear, not confusion, but control, quiet and deliberate, because if they believed I was already fading, then they would never notice the moment I started to move. The next 2 days passed slowly, but not in the way illness slows time. It was different, more deliberate, like every hour was stretching itself just enough for me to notice what I had been ignoring for years. I kept my role intact, speaking less, moving carefully, allowing the nurses to assist me even when I could have managed on my own, because every small detail reinforced the picture they already believed. And that belief was becoming more valuable than anything else. Daniel visited again. That evening, alone this time, which was new, he stood near the foot of the bed for a moment before stepping closer, his hands in his pockets, his posture uncertain in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager trying to explain a mistake. I spoke with the attorney, he said, and I watched him closely, not as a mother searching for reassurance, but as someone observing a pattern unfold, just to make sure everything is in order, he added, the pause in his sentence more revealing than the words themselves. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression soft, unthreatening. That sounds responsible, I replied, and I saw the brief flicker of relief in his eyes, not because I approved, but because I did not question him. He pulled a chair closer and sat down, leaning forward slightly, his voice lowering. We just want to avoid confusion later, he said. And again, there it was, that careful language, designed to sound thoughtful while avoiding the truth beneath it. Confusion. What he meant was control, clarity for himself, not for me. I let a moment pass before speaking, measuring my tone, my pace. Have you already decided what comes next? I asked quietly, and he hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough to confirm that decisions had already been made without me. We are just preparing, he said, choosing his words carefully, and I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but because the pattern was now undeniable. Prepare, organize, simplify. Every word they used pointed in the same direction, one that did not include my voice, my presence, my choice. I shifted slightly in the bed, letting the movement appear heavier than it was, and he noticed immediately. his attention snapping back to my condition, to the role he expected me to play. "You should not worry about any of this," he said quickly. "Just focus on getting better." And that was when I understood something even more clearly. He needed me to stay in that role, needed me to remain passive, because the moment I stepped outside of it, everything would become more complicated for him, for them. I looked at him for a long moment, not with confrontation, but with a quiet awareness he was not prepared for. "I trust you," I said softly, and the words landed exactly as I intended. I saw his shoulders relax, the tension ease from his posture, because trust, for him, meant permission. It meant he could continue without resistance, without accountability, without having to question himself. He nodded, almost too quickly. "Of course," he said. "I will take care of everything." And I let the silence stretch just long enough for that promise to settle in the room, because now it meant something different to me. Not reassurance, but confirmation. After he left, I remained still, listening to the quiet again, the steady rhythm of the monitor, the distant sounds of the hallway, and I replayed the conversation in my mind, not emotionally, but analytically. Every word, every hesitation, every choice he made revealed more than he realized. They were moving forward, not waiting, not hesitating, not questioning whether they should, only how quickly they could. And that meant one thing. They believed the outcome was already certain, that my role in this was already finished, and that belief was their greatest mistake, because it made them careless, it made them predictable, it made them visible in ways they did not understand. I turned my head slightly, looking at the empty chair he had just left behind, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before. This was no longer about disappointment, or even betrayal in the way I had once understood it. It was about revelation, about seeing clearly for the first time. And once something was seen clearly, it could not be unseen, could not be ignored, could not be softened into something more comfortable. I closed my eyes again, not to rest, but to think, to plan, to allow the next steps to form with the same quiet precision they had been using against me. Because if they were already preparing for a future without me, then I needed to prepare for a future where they no longer controlled the outcome. And for the first time since this began, I felt the shape of that future begin to take form, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same calm certainty that had guided me through everything else in my life. Only this time, it was not for them, it was for me. The following morning began with a quiet that felt heavier than before, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because everything underneath had already shifted into place. I lay still, listening to the distant sounds of carts rolling down the hallway, muted conversations, the occasional beep from another room, and I realized how easily life continued around moments that should have stopped everything. Daniel and Sophia arrived together just after 9, their timing precise, coordinated, as if this visit had been planned down to the minute. I kept my eyes closed when they entered, letting them believe I was still resting, because I had learned more from their unguarded moments than from anything they chose to show me. "Did you bring the documents?" Sophia asked quietly, and I felt something in my chest settle, not tighten, not react, just settle into clarity. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice lower than usual. "I spoke with the attorney again this morning. He said it is better to have everything ready in advance." There was a faint rustling sound, paper against fabric, deliberate, careful, and I imagined him holding a folder, organized, labeled, prepared, the way Sophia liked things. "We should not wait too long," she said. "Situations like this can change quickly. Situations like this, not my life, not my health, just a situation. Something to be managed, contained, resolved." I kept my breathing slow, even, letting the silence stretch long enough for them to continue. "Do you think she would sign if we explained it the right way?" Sophia asked. And this time, the question did something different. It did not surprise me. It did not even upset me. It simply confirmed what I already understood. They were not just preparing for my absence. They were planning to move things forward before that moment arrived. Daniel hesitated. And for a brief second, I wondered if there was still a part of him that recognized the line he was standing on. "She trusts me," he said finally, and those 3 words carried more weight than anything else he had said since this began, not because they were true, but because of how he intended to use them. Trust was not something to him anymore. It was a tool, a way to make things easier, faster, cleaner. Then we should not complicate it, Sophia replied, her tone steady, certain. We present it as routine, something that will help later, something responsible. Responsible, again that word, always wrapped in logic, always positioned as the right thing to do. I shifted slightly in the bed, just enough to create the impression of movement, and their conversation stopped immediately, the air in the room changing as they adjusted, stepping back into their roles, the ones they wanted me to see. I opened my eyes slowly, letting them meet mine as if I had just woken. You are here. Early, I said softly, my voice carrying the right amount of fatigue, the right amount of distance. Sophia smiled, warm, composed, practiced. We wanted to check on you, she said, and Daniel stepped closer. The folder no longer visible, but I knew it was still there, somewhere within reach. How are you feeling? He asked, and I looked at him for a moment, long enough to let him feel that I was present, aware, not questioning, just watching. About the same, I replied, and that answer seemed to satisfy them, because it fit the version of me they were holding on to, the one that was not improving, not recovering, not changing the outcome they had already accepted. Sophia reached for the chair and sat down, her posture relaxed, confident. We were thinking about a few practical things, she began, her tone gentle, almost careful, and I could see it now. The transition, the moment where preparation became action, where assumption became decision. I let my expression remain soft, open, the same expression that had allowed them to believe what they wanted for so long. Of course, I said quietly, and in that moment, I saw it clearly, the brief flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, the confirmation that I would not resist, that I would not question, that everything would move forward exactly as they planned. Daniel pulled the folder into view, placing it carefully on the edge of the bed, his movements controlled, deliberate. Just some documents to make things easier later, he said, repeating the same language they had used moments before, and I looked down at the papers, not reading them, not needing to, because their purpose was already clear. This was not about helping me. This was about securing something before they believed it was too late. I placed my hand lightly on the edge of the folder, not opening it, just touching it, grounding myself in the moment, and I realized something then, something that felt almost calm in its certainty. They believed they were guiding this situation, shaping it, controlling it, but they had already revealed everything I needed to know, every intention, every assumption, every step they were willing to take. And now, as I lifted my eyes back to meet theirs, I understood that this moment was not about whether I would sign, it was about what I would do next, because for the first time, the outcome was no longer something they could predict, and that was the one thing they had not prepared for. For a moment, I let my hand rest on the folder as if it carried more weight than it actually did, as if even touching it required effort, and I saw how quickly they interpreted that hesitation, not as thought, but as weakness, as limitation, exactly the way they needed it to be. I slowly slid my hand back, letting it fall gently onto the blanket, my fingers relaxed, my posture unchanged. Maybe later, I said softly, and the words were enough to pause them without raising suspicion. Enough to delay without refusing. Sophia's smile did not fade, but it adjusted, just slightly, becoming more patient, more strategic. Of course, she replied. There is no rush. And that was the first real lie she had spoken out loud in front of me, because everything about their actions suggested the opposite. Daniel nodded, though I could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle tightening that betrayed his need to move forward, to complete something he had already decided should be done. We can come back to it, he said, echoing her tone, and I gave a faint nod, as if that settled the matter, as if I had not already understood exactly what they were trying to accomplish. They stayed a few minutes longer, speaking about small things, safe things, the kind of conversation that filled space without meaning. And then they left, taking their careful expressions and controlled voices with them, but not the truth they had already revealed. When the door closed, I did not move right away. I let the silence settle fully, let the absence of their presence become something clear, something I could think within, and then, slowly, I opened my eyes and turned my head toward the window. The light had shifted again, softer now, longer shadows stretching across the floor, marking the passage of time in a way that felt more honest than anything they had said. A quiet knock came at the door, and without waiting for an answer, Dr. Harris stepped inside, his gaze immediately finding mine. Searching, assessing. I assumed they brought documents, he said, and I nodded once. No explanation needed. He moved closer, lowering his voice slightly. They requested an update this morning, he continued. They wanted confirmation that your condition has not improved. I held his gaze, steady, calm. And what did you tell them? I asked, and there was no hesitation in his response this time. I told them there has been no significant change, he said, and I felt something settle into place. Not relief, not satisfaction, but alignment. Because now everything was moving exactly as it needed to, not according to their plan, but believed they were securing whatever they thought they were preparing for. It depended entirely on one thing, my absence. And that was the one thing I was no longer willing to give them. I closed my eyes slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of focus, letting the plan settle, letting each step take its place with quiet precision. Because when I walked out of this hospital, it would not be as the person they thought they were waiting to lose. It would be as someone they had already underestimated. And that was a mistake they would not be able to correct. 48 hours later, I was sitting upright in the same hospital bed they had already imagined empty, my discharge papers folded neatly on the tray beside me, untouched by their expectations, untouched by the version of events they had already begun to build without me. Dr. Harris had kept his word. Everything had been handled quietly, efficiently, without a single unnecessary detail leaving this room. And now, as the morning light filtered in through the window, I felt something I had not felt in days, not relief, not even satisfaction, but readiness, a calm, steady awareness that the next part of this would not be observed from a distance. It would be lived. I had asked the nurse to delay calling my family, just long enough for me to leave on my own terms. And when I finally stood, placing my feet on the floor, the movement felt solid, grounded, real in a way that made everything else they had believed seem almost fragile by comparison. I dressed slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not hesitating, each motion measured, each step controlled, because this moment mattered, not as an escape, but as a shift, a transition from what they thought was ending into something they had not prepared for. By the time I reached the elevator, I felt steady, not just physically, but mentally. Every piece of the plan settled into place, every possibility accounted for. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. Watching my reflection in the polished metal, the woman looking back at me did not seem weaker, did not seem diminished. She seemed clearer, sharper, more defined than she had been in years, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge it fully. I was not the same person who had walked into that hospital. Something had changed, not in my body, but in my understanding, and that change was not something they would be able to undo. The ride down was quiet, the soft hum of the elevator the only sound. And when the doors opened again, I stepped out into a world that had continued without interruption, cars passing, people moving, everything exactly as it had been, except for me. I took a slow breath, feeling the air settle into my chest, steady, certain, and then I walked forward, not away from something, but towards something, because now, there was work to be done. I did not go home immediately. Instead, I made a stop first, the attorney's office Daniel had mentioned so casually, the one he thought I knew nothing about, the one he believed would help him secure everything before I was gone. The receptionist looked surprised when I gave my name, but she recovered quickly, polite, professional, unaware of the significance of what this visit represented. I would like to review my documents, I said calmly, and within minutes, I was seated across from a man who had already been speaking about me as if I were no longer present. His expression shifted when he saw me, confusion first, then realization, and finally something else, something closer to caution. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I did not explain. I simply asked questions, clear, direct, precise, and with each answer, the picture became even clearer, not because I needed confirmation anymore, but because hearing it spoken aloud removed any remaining distance between suspicion and truth. When I left that office, I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to confront or expose or react, because I understood something far more important than that. I understood that control was not about force, it was about timing, about knowing when to act and when to let others reveal themselves. And they had already done that, completely, without realizing it. I returned to the house on Maple Street just after noon. The same house they had already begun to plan around. The same house they believed would soon belong to them without question, without resistance. I stood at the front door for a moment, my hand resting on the handle, and I thought about everything that had happened, every word, every assumption, every step they had taken based on a belief that was never true. And then I opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar space greeting me with a quiet stillness that felt different now, not empty, not fragile, but waiting for me, not for them. I set my bag down on the table and looked around slowly, taking it all in, the memories, the history, the life that had been built here piece by piece, and I realized something with absolute clarity. They had been waiting for my absence, planning for it, depending on it. But what they never considered, what they never prepared for, was the possibility that I would still be here, fully aware, fully capable, and ready to act. I walked toward the window, letting the light fall across the room, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not out of victory, but out of understanding, because the truth had already been revealed, not by confrontation, not by accusation, but by their own actions, and now, everything that followed would not be about proving anything to them. It would be about deciding what they deserved to lose, because I was not the one they should have been preparing to say goodbye to. I was the one they should have been careful not to underestimate.